Imagine a machine, right, that is just algorithmically designed to keep you continuously, agitated about history.
Oh, yeah. And it's a machine run by people who literally profit off your exhaustion
Hmm.
and, your guilt and your anger.
Exactly. I mean, you probably notice the symptoms of this in your daily life. You turn on the news, it's there. You go to the movies, it's dominating the casting debates.
Right. It's in corporate advertising, neighborhood politics. I mean, honestly, it's even in children's cartoons at this point.
It is everywhere. And today, we are doing a deep dive into a document called The American Blind Spot. And it basically argues that our modern, inescapable obsession with race isn't actually about healing the past at all.
No, not at all. It argues that it's a highly lucrative industry built on top of a psychological glitch.
Right, because the easy, comforting narrative we get fed is just that, well, society's full of prejudiced villains, and if we could just educate or, I don't know, cancel enough bad people, the friction would stop.
Yeah, but the American Blind Spot makes this really compelling case that this explanation is just fundamentally too small for the sheer scale of the phenomenon. Like, to understand why we are locked in this endless loop, we have to look at a pretty volatile intersection.
And we're not here to point fingers or relitigate the daily news cycle, just to be clear.
hmm
Our mission today is to just look at this fascinating source material.
Exactly. We're looking at the mechanics of human social psychology, the modern attention economy, and a very specific historical contradiction that turned race into America's primary tribal sorting mechanism.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the author starts right at the foundation of the house. To grasp the modern obsession, you really have to look at the incredibly unique way the United States was built.
Especially when you hold it up against older, more traditional nations. I mean, look at ancient nations, places like France, Japan, or India.
Right, they have a totally different vibe.
They really do. For the most part, those nations were built around a deep civilizational continuity. They rely on shared ancestry, a long lineage of language, or, deep religious history.
So, France has a centuries-old concept of Frenchness tied to the soil and culture.
Exactly. And Japan has Japaneseness. The people living in those countries, I mean, they might fight bitterly over politics, but they inherit a pre-existing story that tells them who we are.
But America is a completely different historical experiment. It's this massive multi-ethnic superpower attempting to hold itself together without a single ancient ethnic identity at its core.
Right. Instead, the United States is held together by an ideological myth. It isn't bound by bloodlines, it's bound by a promise.
The frontier, the self-made individual, the foundational text that claims, all men are created equal.
But because the nation's entire existence is justified by that specific promise, rather than some ancient shared memory, it has to be constantly tested against reality.
Oh, wow. So when a country justifies its existence through the promise of universal liberty, any visible inequality isn't just a basic social problem.
No, it becomes a massive existential threat. It acts as a literal accusation against the very soul of the nation.
That makes so much sense, because in other countries, ethnic hierarchies or class divides, they might be shrugged off as just like an ugly historical inheritance, just something to manage.
Yeah, but in America, racial inequality becomes a referendum on whether the country is entirely fraudulent. That is why race carries this heavy, almost metaphysical weight here that outsiders often find totally baffling.
The text calls this the colonial structural contradiction. You have a republic speaking the high-minded language of liberty, but it simultaneously organized its land, its labor, its voting rights, and its wealth entirely through racial categories.
Right, we are talking about African slavery, indigenous dispossession, and legally enforced exclusion.
It was a literal ledger dictating who was allowed to belong and build generational wealth. It's like building a state-of-the-art smart home, but the wiring in the walls is from the 1800s. Eventually, things are going to short circuit.
That is a great analogy. The contradiction wasn't a bug in the system. For a very long time, it was the operating system itself.
But let me play devil's advocate for a second, because a lot of people listening might think, well, that ledger was wiped clean a long time ago.
Sure, the civil rights era in the 1960s completely rewrote the legal code.
Exactly. Open racial hierarchy is illegal and entirely unacceptable in mainstream public life today. So why does the source argue we are still stuck in this racial ledger system?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author draws a crucial distinction between legal architecture and material inheritance. America changed the law incredibly fast.
But the older geography of opportunity didn't magically vanish when the Civil Rights Act was signed.
Exactly. The text points out that wealth, neighborhood demographics, school funding, and basic social trust remained massively unequal.
So you have a society that officially and legally rejects racial hierarchy, while the vast majority of its citizens continue to live inside its accumulated, compounded financial consequences.
The machine can still run on the inherited settings. You don't need cartoon villains pulling levers behind a curtain anymore.
Right, you can have a totally race-blind banking algorithm today that denies a mortgage based on a zip code's risk profile. But that zip code's risk profile was literally drawn up by redlining policies in 1936. The mechanism just perpetuates itself.
Yeah, systemic issues persist on autopilot. But the author pushes further, noting that history alone doesn't explain the sheer emotional volatility of our current moment.
Because other societies have brutal histories of conquest and exclusion, yet they don't possess this specific, highly televised, hair-trigger modern obsession.
Exactly. To understand the emotional heat of it, we have to look at the bizarre wiring of human nature.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the source dives straight into social psychology to explain the why.
Right, specifically a landmark piece of research from the 1970s by a social psychologist named Henri Tajfel.
It's known as the minimal group paradigm. And Tajfel basically wanted to understand the absolute minimum condition required for human beings to form a tribe and actively discriminate against outsiders.
He wanted to strip away deep historical grievances and just see what the baseline of human bias was. And, his findings are honestly staggering.
He brought a bunch of teenage schoolboys into a lab and showed them abstract paintings by two artists, right? Paul Klee and Wassily Kandinsky.
Yeah, and the boys were asked which artist they preferred. Then Tajfel divided the boys into two groups based purely on that completely meaningless preference.
The Klee group and the Kandinsky group. And keep in mind, these kids didn't even know who these painters were a day earlier.
Right. Then they were given the task of distributing real money to other participants.
And within minutes, literally minutes, the participants started heavily favoring their own arbitrary group and actively penalizing the other group.
They would even choose to take a lower overall payout for their own group if it meant the rival group got even less. It's crazy.
So the human brain doesn't require centuries of territorial war or ancient theological hatred to divide the world. It is instinctively, desperately eager to manufacture an us and a them.
All it needs is a boundary, however flimsy. The brain is constantly scanning the environment under intense cognitive load, asking who is safe, who is a threat.
Now, take that ancient, primitive tribal instinct and drop it into a continental superpower with deep economic anxiety and declining trust, and the brain just scrambles for a shortcut.
It cannot deeply evaluate the character of every person it encounters, so it looks for a low cognitive effort marker.
And race serves as that crude visual map. It quickly answers the question, who is with me? Who is against me?
The text points out the ultimate American paradox here. Scientifically and biologically, race is a complete fiction. The genetic differences are virtually non-existent.
But socially and historically, it became deeply real infrastructure.
Right. Because our brains are biologically wired to sort people into these tribal groups for perceived safety, and because deeper, slower forms of belonging like strong local communities or shared religious institutions have weakened, the brain just relies on the most available visual material to build substitute tribes out of.
If our brains are hardwired with this tribal glitch, you have to wonder what happens when a capitalist attention economy discovers it. Someone is going to monetize that glitch.
Oh, absolutely. Which brings us to the identity industry and the monetization of tribalism.
And I need to state this explicitly for you listening right now. We are remaining strictly impartial here. We are just reporting on the source material's critique of both progressive and conservative political machinery. We aren't taking any sides.
Right, we are just looking at the cold, hard mechanics of how this system operates today. Modern institutions require what the author calls administrative boxes.
Think about it. Census forms, corporate HR departments, university admissions, political campaign strategists, media algorithms, they all need boxes.
They all require people to sort themselves into crude categories. Once identity becomes data on a form, it translates into administrative power.
Once you have administrative power, it inevitably becomes a massive economic opportunity.
Exactly. The source argues that anger, guilt, and resentment are incredibly profitable. The text notes that real historical wounds absolutely exist. The pain is real.
But the modern attention economy has zero financial incentive to actually heal those wounds. It's like an industry that makes billions treating the symptoms of a disease, so it actively avoids ever curing it.
That's spot on. It processes these wounds through platforms designed to algorithmically reward outrage, speed, and tribal performance.
Because the mechanics of social media rely on engaging the amygdala, right? The fear and anger center of the brain.
Yeah, anger keeps you watching, guilt keeps you posting, fear keeps you donating to political campaigns.
But how does this monetization actually impact the daily trust across different racial and ethnic groups on the ground? Like, we're talking about it more than ever, so shouldn't we be reaching some level of understanding?
Yeah. You'd think so, but no. The author explains that constant conversation about race does not equal racial understanding. The source calls it a racial hyperconsciousness.
And that is just exhausting everyone and actively damaging social trust across racial lines, isn't it?
Totally. People are actively trained by their media diets to read every single mundane interaction as a heavily symbolic, racially charged event. It becomes a permanent state of hypervigilance.
So minorities often feel forced to carry this exhausting, impossible burden of representing an entire demographic group every time they speak.
While white Americans often feel they are being cross-examined for historical sins before they even open their mouths.
And immigrants arrive and feel violently squeezed into census boxes that have absolutely nothing to do with their actual lived histories or cultures.
The debate has just become weaponized as a moral sorting device. For the left, it's proof of compassion. For the right, resistance to it is proof of patriotism.
And the text makes a really striking observation here. It argues that American racial arguments feel distinctly religious.
They really do. Because America has weakened its older religious frameworks, race became the arena for moral drama.
It involves original sin, heresy, guilt, and excommunication. A Twitter pylon functions exactly like a 17th century Salem witch trial.
You have the search for hidden, subconscious sin, the demand for forced public confessions, which, by the way, never actually result in forgiveness.
Never. You just get digitally excommunicated from the community. People aren't arguing about facts, they're hunting for heresy.
The tragedy of treating race as a secular religion is that it leaves everyone completely alienated. The moral purity tests never end, and the structural inequalities never actually get fixed.
So what does this all mean? If both of the dominant approaches are failing, if the colorblind approach of forgetting history is naive, but the hyperfixation of making everyone a symbol is failing too, what does the source actually suggest we do?
What's fascinating here is that the source suggests the antidote might not be about identity at all. It shifts the focus away from the culture war and looks at the foundation of the house, economic security.
Wait, economic security. How does that solve a racial trust deficit?
The text argues that the American obsession with race is actually an obsession with belonging under conditions of scarcity.
Oh, that makes so much sense. When people feel economically abandoned, burdened by debt and loneliness, every difference feels like a threat or a potential enemy.
Exactly the dynamic the author highlights. When you are struggling to pay for groceries or medical bills and the larger nation doesn't feel like a safe home, you retreat.
You retreat into tribal sorting because you're in survival mode. You're looking for that crude, Toshville visual map to figure out who is going to protect you in a zero-sum game.
But the text proposes a structural mechanism for de-escalation. When people feel economically secure, socially rooted, and optimistic about their children's future, racial difference suddenly becomes profoundly less threatening.
So universal economic security could literally, physically lower the societal temperature. It removes the baseline scarcity that makes the tribal sorting feel biologically necessary.
Yes. The source points out that America desperately needs a national story that goes deeper than just consumerism.
The old foundational myth we talked about at the beginning, that anyone can become anything if they work hard enough. It falls completely flat when millions of people are experiencing extreme economic humiliation.
Building a stronger, shared national story, one that focuses on universal material dignity rather than just buying things or political branding, could be the key to resolving these modern tribal divisions.
We have covered incredible ground today. We started by looking at that massive structural contradiction in America's founding, the lofty promise of universal liberty clashing violently with a literal ledger of racial hierarchy.
Right, and then we dug into Henri Tajfel's minimal group paradigm to see how our brains naturally use race as a quick, low-effort tribal signal when scanning for threats.
Uncovered how modern media algorithms and political machines monetize that psychological glitch, turning historical pain into a highly profitable Vegas casino of outrage.
And finally, we explored the mechanics of how building genuine universal economic security might be the ultimate structural antidote to lower the temperature and break the cycle. This raises an important question, one that asks you to step away from the noise and ponder a deeper issue raised by the text.
Yeah.
Instead of asking who is racist or who is innocent, look around at your community and ask yourself, what kind of nation are we actually trying to belong to if race is still the fastest way we decide who counts as us?
That is a profoundly unsettling question to sit with. And next time you turn on the TV or open your social media feed and feel your heart rate spike as those boundaries of us and them are drawn in real time, just take a breath. Ask yourself who is financially profiting from your agitation in that exact moment. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives around you, and we will catch you next time.